The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, SouthBound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
I'm WFAE General Manager, CEO Joe O'Connor. And good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, or wherever in the world you may be right now, because we have a worldwide audience for the Charlotte Podcast Festival that we are so proud to present in collaboration with Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, and Eclecs Creative Agency. WFAE has become a leader in public radio podcasting, and we're excited to share this knowledge with the community, the country, and the world. The festival is a first for the city, for the state, and for the public radio system. It is entirely free, virtual, and open to the public no matter your location or your experience. It highlights the work of North Carolina's podcasters, audio storytellers, and digital producers. And unlike similar conferences, the Charlotte Podcast Festival is devoted to amplifying the South's signature voices and vibrant stories. And that includes more than 60 audio podcast speakers with more than 40 virtual sessions devoted to production, marketing, monetization, and what is so important in this divided country of ours, community building. As WFAE's Executive Vice President and Chief Content Officer, John Marshall, put it, the festival gives WFAE and our partners another way to support the growing podcast community here in Charlotte. It builds on the training that we've provided over the last year through WFAE's Queen City PodQuest Academy and workshops. WFAE remains committed to using podcasting as a way to support particularly diverse storytellers in this community. Now, within 48 hours of the festival's registrations going live, we received more than 2,000 registrations from around the world that has now grown to more than 8,000. And that's the power of podcasting. So let's get going. Let's begin with the moderator of our first panel, whose LinkedIn profile indicates her official title as creative doer and podcaster, which I love, Perrine DeShield. Perrine?
Thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate you greatly. All right, everyone, we're so happy to have you. Welcome, welcome. It's the first day, like we just mentioned, of the Charlotte Podcast Festival, and I'd like to welcome you. Like Joe said, my name is Perrine DeShield. I am the owner and director of Eclecs Creative Agency and creator of the First Gens and the Quarantine Couch podcast. All right, so I'm going to be your moderator here today. And again, we're just super excited to partner with WFAE, the Queen City Podcast Network, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and again, my agency, Eclecs. So this hour session, what you signed up for, yes, it's called Life on the Mic, okay? So we're gonna be talking and chatting about how hosting, honestly, is not as easy, okay, as it looks or sounds. But with these amazing experts, we're gonna teach you all the tricks and tips and give you all the advice that you need to really beast your podcast hosting, all right? So let's say hello to our panelists, all right? We're gonna start with Mark Paris. So Mark hosted the On the Life and Meaning podcast, in which he interviewed 100 people about what mattered most in their lives. He authored On Life and Meaning, 100 essays inspired by 100 guests. He founded Charlotte Viewpoint, a magazine about civic and cultural life, and he is a professor of leadership and ethics at Johnson & Wales University. Let's clap it up for Mark. Yes, Mark.
Thanks,
next, no problem. Happy to have you. Next, we have Bernadette Joy. Bernadette is the founder of Crush Your Money Goals. She teaches how behavior, relationships, emotional, and environment impact our money decisions after paying $300,000 of debt with her husband in just 3 years. 3 years, guys, 300,000. Okay, it's crazy. Her style is inspiring and relatable for those overwhelmed and overlooked by traditional financial services. Her street cred includes national media, including NBC News, Market Watch, and USA Today. Over 20 appearances in different podcasts and has a friendly face on local television. When she's not teaching money, you can find her dancing and singing karaoke, starting a new DIY home project, eating, tons of chocolate with her husband here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Okay, Miss Bernadette, round of applause. All right, just a friendly reminder, everyone, please stay muted. We are going to make sure that our panelists are here and they are, getting all of their information out there and that you can hear them and see us. So again, just a reminder, keep that mic muted. I know you're going to do it. You're a Zoom pro at this point, right? All right, next we have Sheri Lynch. Sheri is an award-winning broadcaster and author of 2 best-selling books and holds a master's degree in social work. Sheri is also an intermediate level tap dancer, a crazy cat and dog lady, and the mom of 2 or 6 or 9 kids, just depending on, who's over for dinner, right? A Philadelphia native who was raised in Northwestern Wyoming. Sheri is a bookworm, a pop culture fanatic, an enthusiast, fan of aliens, Bigfoot zombies, abandoned places, and goofy Americana. When she's not tormenting Bob Lacey, you can usually find her dragging her husband to visit the world's largest spatula or something equally riveting. Shout out to Sheri, round of applause. Cheers to Sheri. And last but certainly not least, we have Tommy Tomlinson. He is the author of the memoir, The Elephant in the Room, about life as an overweight man in growing America. He is also the host of the podcast SouthBound in partnership with WFAE, Charlotte's NPR station. He has written for publications including Esquire, ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Forbes, Garden & Gun, and many others. Tommy has spent 23 years as a reporter and local columnist for the Charlotte Observer, where he was a finalist for a 2005 Pulitzer Prize in commentary. A Pulitzer Prize, guys, okay? His stories have been chosen twice for the Best American Sports Writing Series in 2012 and 2015, and he also appears in the anthology America's Best Newspaper Writing. He has taught at Wake Forest as well as other colleges, workshops, and conferences all across the country, and is a proud graduate of the University of Georgia. Shout out to Mr. Tommy Tomlinson. Again, round of applause. Yes. Woo-hoo! You hear the crowd cheering. I hear you. You're muted, but I hear you. Okay. So we're excited. We're going to have some great conversation about, tons of things today. We look forward to answering your audience questions. Okay. So again, we ask that you keep your audio muted for the session, okay? You can leave your questions, in that cute little Zoom chat that we have there, and we'll try to answer them towards the end of the hour, okay? So just if you start having a question pop up, save it a little bit. You might have another question and then shoot them in the chat. It's like texting. So make sure you do that. A reminder to the audience is that this session will be recorded and made available over email this month. So make sure you check your emails, including your spam and junk folders this week, around this month, in order to receive that session recording. We encourage you to check the full list of sessions of the podcast festival. You can go to charlottepodcastfestival.com and share about the session on social media. You can use the hashtag that you see under my name. It's hashtag CLT Podcast Fest, okay? Again, hashtag CLT Podcast Fest, all right? So get that live tweeting, all that good stuff going. And you can also support the festival by purchasing a brand new Charlotte Podcast Festival t-shirt from our website, just like this beautiful one I'm wearing right now. Yes, I'm modeling for you too, doing all the things. So I'm tired of talking, which is rare because I'm a podcaster for a reason, but we're going to get started. Let's jump on in. We're going to kick it off with Mr. Mark Paris.
Thanks, Perrine. What an introduction. I'm so honored to be part of this. Thanks to WFAE and the sponsors and partners of the festival. It's a treat and honor to kick off this festival and also to be on the panel with Sheri and Tommy and Bernadette. So thanks so much. So I thought I would jot down a few points of advice that I would give to a first-time podcaster, someone who wants to start a podcast and is trying to wrap their mind around it. So I'm a professor of philosophy, so I have some philosophical advice that I think has some practical value for first-time podcasters. So the very first piece of advice that I would offer that I think every professor of philosophy knows well is to know yourself. Know your passions, your interests, your strengths, and weaknesses. Take an inventory of what's important to you, and then make strategic decisions on a deep knowledge of who you are. For me, as I thought about launching the podcast, I know that I really enjoy people, understanding what they love and who they are and what makes them tick. I'm drawn to people who are good-hearted, creative people who want to make a difference in the world. And I wanted a podcast where I would have an opportunity to talk to those kinds of people and also to showcase all the contributions that they make. I also love big, unanswerable, yet inescapable questions about life. How we find meaning, what's good, what's true, how do we know? These kind of deep questions about how we figure out a good life. So putting those two things together became the basis of the On Life and Meaning podcast. And I think it's really important that as a podcaster, you choose a topic that is inexhaustible to you. There's a tendency to chase an audience, to try to give an audience what they want, but I think it really needs to start with a point of passion that you have, because that will sustain you. I also think it's important to choose a format that is suited to your personality. There's lots of formats out there. There's storytelling, there's narrative, there's documentary, there are 10-minute podcasts, there are 2-hour podcasts. For me, I prefer long-form discussion. I like asking short, brief questions and getting out of the way and listening to what my guest has to say and being patient for moments of surprise and poignancy to emerge. So some people might like that from a host. Some people might prefer other types of hosts. I think that, again, you have to trust yourself and trust that your audience will find you. I think it's also important, as you think about knowing yourself, to know what your energy level is and how you prefer to work. I prefer projects that have a beginning, middle, and end. As you think about your podcast, is it seasonal? Is it open-ended? Does it have a target end in mind? For me, I prefer projects that have a clear end. I stay creatively sharp that way. It allows me to run hard across a finish line. And I like what I call middle distance projects, projects that allow me to get my legs underneath me, to run hard, but I know that I have an end in sight. Early on with my podcast, I publicly committed to 100 episodes with 100 essays in 100 weeks while having a full-time job. And that was really an insane schedule, but it was a pace that allowed me to keep my intensity up. And sharing that commitment publicly, I felt compelled to meet that promise. So that was the way that I made sure that I brought it to its completion. I think first-time podcasters should also think about creative control. To what extent creative control is important to them. The podcast allowed me to work on all aspects that I care about, preparing for the interview, doing the interview, editing the interview, writing an essay afterwards, writing the show notes. I could produce what I wanted the way that I wanted. And I think as you make decisions about format and partnering and how it's going to be broadcast, all of the creative control element, I think, is really critical as to whether you're going to be happy and do great work. I think it's also really important to know your weaknesses and to have a strategy around them. I'm not very good with technology. I can barely turn on a microphone. I don't really enjoy social media or marketing. I know what good design looks like, but I really can't create good design. So having great teammates is really critical to realize a vision. And for me, I had teammates Andy Go, who helped me with production, and Chris Curtin, who helped me with design and branding. The podcast would not be what it is without having them been involved. So I always remain grateful to them. The second idea that I would leave you with is connect the podcast to a bigger idea. A podcast is a podcast, but there's an opportunity to reimagine it and to think of it differently. I tried to think of the On Life and Meaning podcast in artistic terms. How could it be more than a podcast? How can I rethink it? And the metaphor that helped drive my decision-making was thinking of it as an art gallery of portraits that people could visit over and over again, just like they would go to a portrait museum. So once that metaphor was in place, that led to a lot of creative ideas. So first, the interviews would have to be evergreen. The questions and answers would have to stand the test of time, just like portraits in a gallery. It also meant that there was an opportunity with our website to make it look like an art gallery. So great photographs, beautifully displayed with extensive liner notes. The website for me was as much part of the podcast as the podcast itself. Well, when we have art galleries, we have openings and people come and see the work. And so we saw an opportunity to have live events around our podcast. We hosted gatherings, one around one way through the run and one at the end, where we gathered all the guests and their significant others and brought them into, and had a celebration and brought them into a party. So the energy in the room was fantastic, and it just made the podcast come into the real world. And then finally, it meant producing a hardcover book that profiled each 100 guests of the podcast, a book that you might see in an art gallery gift shop. So I wanted the book itself to be an art object. And I worked with Phoebe Pressler at Spark Publications, one of my 100 guests, to produce the book, and I'm really proud of what it became. So all of those were ways of kind of thinking bigger than simply the podcast itself. I think having a larger vision pushes you creatively. And I'm really proud of sort of the ecosystem that we created around it. The last piece of advice I would give very briefly is love whatever happens. One of my favorite philosophers is Friedrich Nietzsche, who was interested in how we affirm life in the face of suffering. Well, sometimes there's a lot of suffering in podcasting, right? You don't turn on your microphone, you don't record interviews, there are money issues, production issues, people issues, marketing issues. And I would say love it all. Love the suffering as much as you love the rewards. Embrace all the messiness of it. The process of the podcast is as much, if not more, of the experience as the product of the podcast itself. So embrace all of what it might mean. I'll leave you on this note. The very best part of the project for me was the 100 guests of the podcast who I got to spend time with intimately and authentically. Amazing, amazing people. And I look at that list in retrospect, and I'm kind of blown away about how fortunate I was and that I was able to complete the project from beginning to end. It's almost an out-of-body experience now, looking back on it from beginning to end. And I'm forever, forever grateful to the folks who gave their time, their energy, and were willing to share their lives with me. So that's the advice that I would give to first-time podcasters.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much, Mark. That was amazing. So amazing. We are next going to turn it on over to Bernadette Joy.
There we go. Thanks so much for having me. I am Bernadette Joy. I was very excited to have a reason to wear my Super Mario denim jacket. So this is the one time I get to wear it during all of COVID. And I started a podcast. Initially it was called Crush This Debt. It is now called Dear Bernadette Joy. You can see the spelling of it in my name right here. And I started podcasting by accident, 100%. As Corinne mentioned, my story comes from having paid off $300,000 of debt in 3 years with my husband. And I initially started sharing that story on Instagram, and a lot of people started reaching out to me saying, hey, can I get you for a cup of coffee, or can I pick your brain about how you did that? And one day I went to my husband after like 10 cups of coffee, and if you can't tell, I do not need to drink any more coffee. I said, is there a way that I could just record my answer and just like give it to people so that I don't have to repeat myself? He's like, you know, that's called a podcast, right? So that's what I did. I recorded a podcast, and the intent was for it to be 10 episodes documenting exactly, you know, what we did to pay off debt, and in a different way than I heard a lot of the other financial advice. And one of the reasons I decided to do my own podcast, even though if you go into, you know, podcast world and see that there's hundreds of podcasts on money, is that I made it very personal to my story. And I also found that there weren't a lot of people who look like me, who talk like me, who had the experience that I did. And I wanted to represent, you know, people who were not otherwise represented, specifically in the financial industry. And so that was 2 years ago, which I can't believe. And 2 years later, what I intended to be a 10 episode deal, I'm now in my 4th season, doing the podcast. And I initially started doing the podcast with a different format than I heard a lot of other podcasts with the interview format. I decided to do more of the narrative storytelling. And so knew that I was not going to be able to do that myself. So I too, like Mark, also employed Andy Go, like to help me with my podcast. And it was awesome because what he forced me to do was, instead of kind of going off the cuff, which you can tell I normally will do for hours on end, he got me into the mindset of like, why don't we actually try scripting this and do it like a narrative and put in sound effects and make it more like just a completely different art form. And I was like, hey, Andy, I'm not an artist. I'm not a podcaster. I own a business. I know that sounds like a lot, but he really encouraged me to do that. And it turned out so much better than I expected. And it feels like something that I can look back 50 years from now and be like, oh yeah, like this is what I was like at that time. And this was my story, and it's now forever memorialized. And so that's been super exciting. And then seasons 2 and 3, I went to the interview format, which was super fun for all the reasons that Mark mentioned. But this season I decided to go back to my roots, and this season is going to be me scripting out and talking more specifically where I am in my journey now in finance and answering people's questions on how to pay off debt, you know, how to invest in yourself outside of the means that people are looking to do. And what has been so unexpected is that 2 years ago, I was like, podcast, 10 episodes, done deal. And then I started getting requests to do TV interviews. And then I started getting requests to write articles. And right before I got on this call, I was talking to a producer for like a national television show to do a segment. And they're like, can you tell me a little bit more of my story? And I was like, I will send you my podcast and you can listen to it. So there's lots of great ways that you can use your podcast to, you know, do the work that you want to do. In my case, I never really considered myself a podcaster, but a business owner who happens to have a podcast. So just know that if you don't have a grand plan for your podcast, neither did I. And it's been the journey of a lifetime. So I am super excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. That was awesome. Representation definitely matters. Thank you. All right, we're going to kick it off to Sheri Lynch next.
Yeah, hey, I'm really excited to be a part of this. I've been podcasting since 2006, which in podcasting terms is prehistoric. When I launched our first podcast, Apple wasn't even digitally encoding the shows. And so in order to get that digital encoding years later down the road, we had to break our own RSS feed. When I started podcasting, it was a really fringy art form, but I really believed in it. I saw that it had so much potential for storytellers and so much potential to kind of democratize broadcasting and audio, and I really wanted to be a part of that. So we launched our first podcast in 2006. Today I have 3 in the market, and I also, for funsies, co-hosted the Charlotte Mint Museum's Art Crush podcast, which was the most glorious opportunity to sit down and talk to artists in detail about their work. So because I've been podcasting for so long, I've kind of had a front row seat for the changes that have affected the medium. And a lot of questions that I get from podcasters are around the business side of podcasting, the monetization side of podcasting. And before we get to that, I have to say that there are 750,000 podcasts, unique shows out there, 750,000. And that's a lot of choices for listeners to make. So before you throw your voice into that number, it's really important to know, what is the story that you want to tell, and who is this story for? And maybe most importantly, why are you doing it? Because there are a million reasons to have a podcast. Sometimes you're a business owner who happens to have a podcast. Sometimes it's a passion project. Sometimes it's a way to get your work out there as a comedian or a journalist or a political scientist. But before you can begin, you really have to have that what and who and why piece figured out, because it is a crowded marketplace. And there's something called pod fade. If you've never heard that expression before, pod fade is, it means how many episodes the typical podcast goes before the host runs out of steam. And the answer for pod fade is 7, because it's really fun to have a podcast, and it's really easy for the first 7 episodes. And then you hit that wall of, what am I going to do this week? What's my content going to be? Where am I going to go? Which is why I always circle back to, who is your story for? What is your story about? Why are you telling this story? And it's become a business in a way that it wasn't in the early days. Like, I miss the early days of podcasting when it was a little bit more of a fringy kind of Wild West sort of environment. Big advertising, big dollars are coming into podcasting now, and they're radically changing the shape of it. And that's going to impact all of you, whether you're just starting, just thinking about starting, whether you're a couple of seasons in. In the beginning, in the early days of podcasting, everybody was all about downloads. You know, how many downloads do I get? Well, the technology has improved, and now downloads aren't really the metric. Now it's about impressions. I mean, I know podcasters that think it would be amazing to pull 100,000 downloads or 200,000 downloads. I pull 500,000 on an episode and am not getting rich. I'm telling you that the game has changed for monetization, which is why it's increasingly important that podcasting, which has always been a content-driven medium, a storyteller's medium, whether that story is about how to get out of debt, or what makes life worth living, or what happened at the Panthers game last week, whatever the story is about, it's always been a creator's medium. But as it becomes sort of codified and made into a commodity, opportunities for podcasters are changing. And I think it's important to be aware of that landscape, although I would never discourage anyone from jumping in. So the reason that I started podcasting is I'm a radio personality. My show is syndicated around the country and around the world on Armed Forces Radio. And radio syndication is heartbreaking. You have a station, you lose a station. You win some, you lose some. But you end up with these clusters of listeners, this audience that are disenfranchised. And so back in 2006, we thought, what if we created a free-floating digital outpost where people who like the show can go if the show leaves their market? And so that is the first flagship podcast that I did that's still in operation today, 5 days a week. It's a free-floating digital radio station. Then there were stories that I couldn't tell in my day job, stories that were too complex to fit into a 3-minute window, stories that were maybe too edgy for, mainstream broadcast. And so then I created a non-broadcast narrative storytelling podcast that is anything I want it to be on any given episode. I'm a book person. I'm just such a giant bookworm. I love talking to writers. But if I'm going to talk to a writer, I want to talk to a writer. for more than 3 minutes. I want to really dig deep. So sometimes it's an interview, and it's an interview with an author or an actor, a writer, a comedian, a musician. Sometimes it's an interview with a real person who's got something going on that I've spotted on social media or in the news. Sometimes it's just a conversation. And that brings me to, what does it take to be an interviewer in a podcast? I'm going to make it really simple. It takes exactly what it takes to have a conversation with someone at dinner. You know the saying, you've probably heard it, when you're in a conversation with someone, you shouldn't be focused on what you're going to say next. You should be listening to what the other person is saying. Maybe you've heard this in marriage counseling or couples counseling. That's the secret sauce of interviewing. You do all your homework, you prep. If you're having an author on, you read the book. If you're having an actor on, you look at the work. If you're having a journalist on to talk about a breaking story, you do the homework and do the research on the story. And then, and this is the glory of podcasting, then you have a conversation and you listen to what this person says, because everything that your guest says gives you an extraordinary jumping off point to create something far beyond a traditional interview. I never give guests a list of questions in advance. And when publicists try to give that to me, I accept it and I'm polite and I thank you because I'm a nice Southern lady now, but I don't use them. Because I think that the difference between podcasting and other forms of audio is that podcasting is narrative. It is about storytelling. And sometimes that story takes the shape of a conversation. And I think it is so important to respect not just your guest, but really to respect your listener by inviting them into that conversation, by imagining them in the seat at the table, the invisible seat at the table, and they're listening to what your guest is saying and what might they ask? What question might come out of that comment? And you can go down some really wonderful rabbit holes that way. So that would be my primary tip for interviewing. Just pretend you're having a conversation. And as far as monetization goes, because I know a lot of people are fascinated by that, I'm going to tell you guys a really scary campfire story. About this time a year ago, I went to America's first all podcast advertising agency. It's all they do. And I spent 3 hours and I walked out of that room shaking and wanting to throw up. And here's why. This medium that for us is all about stories and engagement and connection. For the industry that's coming in to swallow us, it's all about data and data points. A lot of decisions are made. They don't even know what the show is about or what the host is about or where your heart and soul are. It really comes down to what are your downloads, what are your impressions, what are your demographics. And so it's kind of heartbreaking for me to see podcasting grow up and head that way. But it is the reality that we operate in. And I think it's an important thing to know as a podcaster that in order to be successful, you've got to have a whole lot of questions answered for yourself before you ever key that mic. Who am I talking to? What am I talking about? Why am I here? And then the most important skill a podcaster can have is being a great listener. More than anything, more than microphones and equipment and websites and advertising, more than anything, a great podcaster is a great listener. That's it for me.
Thank you so, so much, Sheri. That was amazing, amazing. So many gems. And thank you everyone for putting your questions in the chat. Again, we're going to make sure that we get to everyone's questions when we get to the end, when we do our Q&A. So we have our final panelist, Mr. Tommy Tomlinson. Yay, Tommy. All right, let's go.
And there are few words that make people happier than final panelist. So I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as possible because I want to hear y'all's questions, to be honest. I had the idea for this podcast I do way before I actually did it because I was afraid to do it. As you can tell, I have a weird voice. I had throat surgery many years ago, almost 30 years ago now, and it left me with this kind of raspy voice, which is obviously not a radio voice. As I often say, you have a face for radio and a voice for print. And so I had this idea years ago about doing a conversational podcast with notable Southerners, because I grew up in the South. I've lived in the South basically my whole life, and I've been fascinated by, as Patterson Hood of the Drive-By Truckers band calls, the duality of the Southern thing, all the contradictions and complications of being a Southerner. But I didn't want to hear my own voice on the radio or on a podcast or anything else until I started listening to a lot of other podcasts. And one of the things I figured out pretty quickly is that the field is pretty wide open. There are all sorts of different voices out there. You don't have to have an NPR quality voice to host a podcast. You can have your own weird speech patterns and your own weird ways of saying things and whatever it is, and you can still do this. And so that was one thing that helped me move along and kind of into this job that I've been doing now for 2 or 3 years. I want to echo just a couple of the things that other folks have said and then kind of move into a couple of pieces of my own advice. I think it was important for me to figure out why I want to do what I do and what makes me distinctive from other people who might be doing the same thing. There can be lots of podcasts on one thing, but yours has to have some little different turn of the screw, some little twist or something. And also it's important that pod fade that Sheri talked about is a real thing. I've done like 75 episodes now of this podcast, and it got way easier after about 15 because like numbers 5 through 15 were really hard because I've thought pretty quickly that I run out of ideas. And so, so I think those things are really helpful, but I want to talk about a couple of the things that are huge benefits to doing this sort of work or this art, which is kind of an art. There's craft to it, but it can be art. And I think the first one is the intimacy of it. So there are a couple hundred people in this Zoom room right now. But if we do this right, if I do this right, it feels like it's just me talking to you. And if we do this right and I do this right, when you answer, it feels like you're just talking to me. And when people listen to it, it feels like almost at the same time this weird sort of metaphysical thing happens where you feel like you're eavesdropping on an intimate conversation, maybe somebody over at the next table at a bar, but you're somehow part of it at the same time. Nothing but audio does that in that way. You know, you may put your headphones on or your earbuds. You can close your eyes and tilt your head back, and you can listen and hear like the littlest things, the littlest nuances in somebody's voice, a dog barking in the background, whatever it is. Those little things all play a role in the little drama that you've laid out in your podcast. And so I think that is something that podcasting has an advantage in radio, audio type journalism over just about anything else. I think the other thing that podcasting has a great advantage of, especially over what I think of as traditional radio, which moves really fast, is that there are times for silence. Silence, one of the things I learned early in my career as an interviewer, is that silence is this great generator of good stuff. Because I'm going to talk for a while, and then I'm just going to stop. And when you do that, the person on the other end of the line, so to speak, really wants to fill that space. And they will often fill it with something that maybe they didn't want to tell you about before, or maybe a story that they desperately came up with just to have something to talk about. Those silences in the middle of a podcast can be just as important as what people are saying. It's like they talk about in music, sometimes the important notes are the ones you don't play. When I edit my podcast, I try to leave room when I can for those thoughtful silences that happened in the conversation so that people can think along with me and they can catch up. And as I'm listening, they're wondering what that person's going to say next. So those are a couple of just things that I think podcasting can do that maybe other forms of media have difficulty doing. I want to take the rest of my time real quick just to talk about, I guess for lack of a better word, audience. When you start out, the last thing, like the absolute last thing you should care about is how many people listen to your podcast. I started out when I started doing this podcast for WFAE. We have the numbers. I'm sure that Joni Deutsch, who does our podcast at WFAE, I'm sure our staff keeps detailed records of every listener to my podcast. It has been years since I've paid attention to it. I figure as long as I'm employed there, I'm doing okay. And if I'm not doing okay, they'll let me know. And you need to say what you want to say, create what you want to create, and see if that builds an audience. Steve Martin, the comedian, said about comedy, how do you get to be successful? He said, be so good that nobody can ignore you. And when you start off doing a podcast or any form of craft or art, you're not going to be good at first. And so don't worry about having a bunch of listeners, especially at first. Use that time to get better and to be good, and have faith that when you are good, that the audience will find you. The other thing about that is, I don't think you have to have a huge audience to consider yourself a success. There are musicians now, in the days when people could tour before the pandemic. I've heard from several touring musicians, you can make a living with 1,000 true fans. The people who buy your record every time, buy your t-shirts when they come out, buy whatever you've got for sale or whatever you're selling, they're buying. It doesn't have to be a huge crowd to be a success. I never thought that what I do on this podcast is going to have millions and millions of listeners. If it turns out that happens, great. If it doesn't, I'm still creating something that I'm proud of and interested in. And I guess, and that leads to the last part of it, and then I'll shut up. The joy in all this, for me, has never been about the big audience. It's never been about a funky edit or a nifty bit of music that I dropped in somewhere. It's really hasn't been about even people saying they liked it, although I've been lucky enough to have some of that. The joy is in creating the thing. The joy is in having those conversations. If nobody ever listens to your podcast and you end up creating 10 hours of something you're proud of, or 100 or 1,000, that's the reward. The other rewards, if they come, that's a wonderful thing. But appreciate what you're doing, appreciate the moments that you're doing it, and let that be its own reward. Thanks.
Wow, 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 wow. Wow. That was just amazing. Thank you so, so much, Tommy. Per usual, dropped so many amazing gems. You all have been dropping some amazing questions. So shout out to you. We are about to start our Q&A session. Just thank you so much to our panelists for the amazing knowledge and just perspective and experience that they've shared today. So again, remember that you can put your question here in the chat. There are a few people who have, already submitted some questions. So I'm going to shoot those out to our panelists now. Panelists, feel free to answer the questions accordingly, okay? So our first question comes from Diane Brown Towns. Diane said, what is the best platform for monetization? And I think that one was originally directed to Sheri, but definitely open to anyone.
I think that it really depends, because when you get into a monetization relationship, it costs you, and there are a handful of groups out there that I would recommend. I really think that Omni Media, OMNY, Omni Media, Triton, and Westwood One have an advantage at this point, because they've got the infrastructure built up to do the dynamic insertion and all of the host read ads and all of that stuff. I just have to warn you that monetization is not the golden promised land that we all hoped it would be or thought it was. So this is why, and I've been doing this since 2006, and my first priority is always the quality of the product, everything else second. Have a great product that you're proud of, like Tommy said. Tell a story that only you could tell, and then the dollars will find you. And I know that's probably not as exact and specific advice as you would like, but we could do a whole panel just on monetization and how many squirrely side dark alleys there are in that. That's why I say focus on the content always first, and then let the dollars hunt you down.
I'd like to second that notion. Absolutely. I've actually gotten, offers for monetizing my podcast, and I've turned them all down so far because none of them felt right in terms of being aligned with the content that I want to put out, and, having control over the branding of it and stuff too. And so, I think that it's like Sheri said, it's a fine line that you have to, draw with that. But I would say that a podcast is a great launch pad to other ways to monetize. And so myself being an example of, have I made money off of the podcast directly, but have I made money because of all the speaking engagements that I booked because of the podcast? Yes, I have, right? So, trying to think for like the direct hit to it is what a lot of people do. And I would encourage you to think about the longer tailed vision of what the podcast can lead you into other ways to make money.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Bernadette. You made some really, really great points there. So our next question comes from Toby Hansen. Toby said, what's the best way to cross-promote podcasts? Are there any exchanges for that purpose?
Does anybody want to jump in?
Well, I'll jump in real quick. At WFAE, Joni, who does our podcast, is really good at this. And the thing to do is to figure out what podcasts are most like yours, and then offer to cross promote, to do what we call a mid-roll, which is basically a little promotional thing in the middle of our podcast. And so we've looked for other sort of Southern-based podcasts to do that with. We make offers to them. We write up something, put in theirs. They do something for ours, and it is a good way, I think, to get the word out to other people who'd be more likely to listen to what you have to say. I'm sorry, Sheri, go ahead.
No, Tommy's exactly right. There's actually a ton of data out there that shows how people discover podcasts, and it's word of mouth. I like a lot of true crime and a lot of political stuff, and I tend to find my next podcast from the one I'm currently listening to. So Tommy's absolutely right. You want to find kindred spirits, similar content creators, and reach out. Hey, I'd love to have you as a guest on my show. Love to be a guest on yours. Can we do some cross promotion? Because the folks that are listening to podcasts, and the data, oh my God, you guys, the data is so fascinating on audio usage, traditional media, podcasting. It's like you could just get lost in it. But the big through line is people who enjoy podcasts are listening to podcasts to find the next show that they're going to listen to. So you definitely want to be aggressive and reach out. And I saw one of the questions in the stream was, how do I get guests for my podcast if I have an unknown show? You go hunt them down, DM them on Twitter and Instagram, and you'd be surprised at how reachable people can be. It's all about finding those affinities and those kindred spirits and those synergies.
And I would add to what you said is one thing not to do, and I've seen it on both sides. I've been approached to be on my podcast and people asking me to be on their podcast. And it's very clear who's actually done the research on you beforehand, right? And so I've gotten many requests to be a guest on my podcast, and they're like, oh, I'm so-and-so, I do this, I talk about this. I'm like, that has nothing to do with anything that I talk about in my podcast, right? And so, if you are going to go and make those reach outs, be sure to do your research, show that you're genuinely interested in their message and what they have to say, and finding those people that telling them that their message resonates with you goes such a long way.
Yes. And shout out to just what was mentioned about finding guests, right? I think that DMs, messages, just working within your network, it makes a huge difference. And we have a session about great podcast guests and how to get, more information on that. So make sure you go to charlottepodcastfestival.com and find our session that aligns with finding great guests. Okay, so next we have a question from Ann Moebs. I hope I'm saying Moebs. I hope I'm saying your name correctly, Ann. She said, is it typical for guests to require final approval on their segment?
I've had probably 50-50 of people doing that. And I would say the ones who do have larger brands or who have a stronger following have asked to listen to the podcast recording, and I would say I appreciate the courtesy being extended when it's been given to me as a guest, but not everyone has asked me personally.
Oddcast, that's what started.
It's interesting. So, WFAE, which my podcast is through, is an NPR station. It's basically a journalistic enterprise, and because of that, we would never play a podcast for anybody in advance of listening to it. In the same way, we wouldn't tell somebody we wouldn't show somebody a story that we had written or done or whatever. And so, it's different depending on where you come from and who owns the material or whatever. I guess I would generally warn against that. And I guess it's my journalist instinct, because people want to listen to stuff often because they want to change it, or they don't like the way something came out. And often you might think that's the best part, and you don't want to get into an argument with your guest about it before the thing even airs. And so nobody has asked us, to my knowledge, to listen to one of our episodes in advance. And if they did, I would tell them no.
Yeah, I would say with On Life and Meaning, it came up in informal conversations as we prepped for the interview. Someone might say, "Hey, do I get a chance to listen to this before it airs and before it's edited?" And we just had a conversation about it. So much of what On Life and Meaning was about was it just required a lot of trust, because we went into sort of very deep and intimate and vulnerable areas in our conversation. So a relationship of trust was really important. So no one had ever insisted on it. There was only one person who made it a condition of the interview, and that person never became part of the podcast. So yeah, that was never an issue with us.
Jen. All right. Okay. So we have just a few more minutes, everyone. So we want to try to get to maybe 2 more questions. So Brandon Mitchell said, what are some tips to practice active listening? So when you're taking all of that in from the guests, like how can you, make sure that you're properly actively listening?
I'm a social worker and active listening is part of our training. I think the most important thing to do is to not be so nervous. People tend to not be listening when they're so terrified. If you've done the prep, you've read the book or you have researched your guest and you know your stuff, you're ready to just relax and be a part of that conversation for that invisible listener who's sitting there with you. So that's just what it comes down to, is just doing enough of the prep to be relaxed and ready and able to take advantage of the opportunities that come to you in that conversation. Active listening means being still and not getting defensive, not looking for opportunities to make your point, which means if you roll into the conversation with a point to make, if you're looking to ambush a guest, you're going to miss the whole train. You might succeed in the ambush, but it's not going to be a pleasant experience for anybody involved. Active listening means putting your own ego to the side and just attending to what's being said. And as far as giving a guest approval, if I'm interviewing someone about a super sensitive subject, I'll say to them ahead of time, hey, we'll talk about whatever we talk about. If I touch on something that you're really uncomfortable with, let's talk about it at the end. It hasn't happened yet, but I do think it's important to give people the opportunity to control their own narrative. But if you're really, really listening, you'll know when you've stepped on a little bit of a landmine. Just get your ego out of it. It's already your podcast. Your name's on it. It's your guest's chance to shine.
Yes.
I might add real quick about how to listen better. The first thing is to just clear the clutter from wherever you're talking, the desk or whatever. Don't be looking at Twitter while the conversation's going on. Don't be worried about the clock. Just have the conversation. It's not live, but most of them aren't live. Anyway, you're taping the thing. So if you screw up, you screw up. It's fine. And the other thing I would say is, what Sheri said about prep is so important. If you prep well, write down some questions, and then I would encourage you, after you've done it a couple of times, just before the podcast starts, fold up those questions and stick them in your pocket. You'll be thinking about what you want to talk about, but you won't be interrogating the other person. You want it to be a conversation. And so I guess in short, I'm just saying, be a human being and just have a conversation with somebody. And that comes through so much clearer than if you're just banging questions at somebody.
Agreed. All right, everyone, we are right at 7 o'clock. Again, round of applause to our panelists. Thank you, Mark, Tommy, Sheri, Bernadette. You all were amazing. Everyone here, our participants, you're amazing. Thank you so much for your questions. A lot of you have really great questions that can also be answered by participating in our additional sessions. So from editing to picking the right guests to, just being in this entire new age where we are so dependent on virtual interactions, know that you all can find even more information by joining and registering for free for our additional podcasting sessions. So again, please make sure you go to www.charlottepodcastfestival.com. Thank you so much to everyone who submitted questions, and we're so thankful. Another reminder, our session was recorded. It will be emailed to you within this month, so look out for that. Make sure you check all your folders, but as a registered participant, you will receive this session recorded and sent to you. We will, again, have this entire month of free podcast sessions. We encourage you all to share your experience by using CLT Podcast Fest. So again, hashtag CLT Podcast Fest, just like the shirt says, on social media. And again, you can pick up a beautiful t-shirt just like mine on, again, our podcast festival website. And we also have some amazing virtual podcast happy hours, okay? Like this Friday, we have one at 6 p.m. where you can mix and mingle and just chat it on up with other podcasters here from all around the world. We're not just here in Charlotte, y'all. Like, we have expanded. Like, it's so amazing to see how this festival has grown and reached so many people. So know that you can register for that happy hour also on our website. So again, thank you so much. I'm Perrine DeShield. I hope to see you soon at another session this month, because I know you're going to register for 1 million of them. Yeah, even though we don't have 1 million, it's fine. Thanks so much. Again, go to www.charlottepodcastfestival.com. Yay, thank you. Enjoy your evening.